A glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bottle said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross-Time Pub, exploring the world of ancient ideas, combing curious collections, and addressing the occasional odd tale of anthropophagy in the wild, wild west. I'm Micah Hanks, along with my cohorts and colleagues, Jason Pentrail and James Waldo. Gents, how we doing?
Doing great, man. We've all been traveling yet again.
You know, it seems like forever that we've been in the Cross-Time Pub. I've missed it. Even though I like getting out on the road, but it's nice to visit with you fellas again.
It must just be that busy travel time of the year. Of course, I was out there in Wyoming near the little town of Hewlett, got to see the enigmatic Devil's Tower. And of course, my company, they were all into it because of the way it's been featured in not only just popular media over the years, but of course, preeminently in the Steven Spielberg film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Admittedly, I had never seen that film until finally, having gone to the Devil's Tower, I thought, maybe I should watch this. But James, you'd appreciate this because, again, what we appear to be looking at with the Devil's Tower is a laccolithic formation of igneous rock that they think was an old volcanic chute where the magma solidified, but that the rest of the land around it eroded, which left this laccolith.
Yeah, so what you've got left, sometimes it's called a volcanic plug. Mm-hmm. So the volcano itself is not really that resilient to weathering. You know, it's piled up ash and different layers that are somewhat fairly unconsolidated, and they get compressed down under their own weight. But over time, they weather away, especially after the volcano goes extinct. But the basalt is quite resilient to weathering. And what's cool about the Devil's Tower is it has those vertical striations, and that's called columnar jointing. Ah. You'll see it in other places. There's a place, I think, in Scotland where there's a columnar jointing, and it's right on the coast, and I forget what they call it, something with Giant's
Causeway.
That's it. It has to do with the mineral assemblages in the magma itself or in the lava. As it cools, it forms these hexagonal columns. And it's a very interesting process, and I can't say that I completely understand it, but I know it when I see it.
Man, that's great because everything that you said was more than anybody out there at the site actually knew. And I noticed the hexagonal structure in some of these great big columns. I mean, you can see where the entire rubble field of stone around the base of Devil's Tower are portions of the column that have broken off over time. Now, the funny theory that was going on out there, I'm sure you guys have heard this. Anybody want to guess what the funny theory was?
You go, Jason.
Could be anything. Who knows?
Okay, so this is, I'll put it to you like this. So I was with Race Hobbs, and we're entering the park, and he says to the guide, or the guy who was working the little ticket box there, he said, "Man, I think that's a great big giant petrified tree stump." And
wow, that was a serious tree.
Yeah, well, of course, Hobbs was just joking, but the guy who was working the ticket booth says, no, I'm a geologist, and actually I can guarantee you it's not a tree stump. But this is a popular theory among the so-called flat earth movement. Somehow belief that Devil's Tower is a giant tree stump, a petrified one. Somehow that actually validates in their mind the idea of a flat earth. I haven't figured that one out. Talk about a real mystery.
Yeah, I was going to ask for some clarification on that, but apparently nobody really knows, so we'll just leave it at that, I guess.
Right. But no, about those weird columns, again, that was one of the most interesting things, and I took a lot of pictures while I was there because you can see the broken columns that have, again, just littered the entire landscape around the base of the tower. And I'm looking at these things and standing on one that's roughly the size of a school bus thinking, and what do we do if another one falls right now? A site like Devil's Tower, standing in front of something like that, first of all, when you're a few miles out and you just see this incredible monolith rising out of the horizon, I mean, there's nothing like it. And the immensity of it when you're standing at the base of it reminds us, I think in a very good way, in a cosmic way, how small we all are. But speaking of how small we are and looking at things like this throughout history, guys, I've told you a few times about this. It's a show that I learned about, I think, on a thread on archaeology on Reddit. And somebody had made a comment on this thread. They said, it was a question I think somebody put up about what are the best documentaries on ancient Egypt. And somebody on this Reddit thread said, the very best one, hands down, that you'll ever watch is Romer's Egypt. And I'm thinking, who's Romer? Well, this is John Romer, and you can actually buy a lot of his books. He's written all kinds of great books on ancient Egypt that are available on Amazon, and I intend to buy a few of them. But Romer's Egypt, it was apparently a TV show that was broadcast by the BBC way back in the day. And I don't think that there are very many existing copies of it, but according to a YouTuber named Throw Out the Line, who has put parts 1, 2, and 3, I think there were only 3 episodes of it, he's put them all up on YouTube, salvaged from a VHS tape, and he wrote this. He said, John Romer's first television series, originally broadcast on BBC Two in 1982, a year before I was even born, where he, quote, plum picks traveling to places for which I have a particular passion, which spans Egyptian history from 5000 to 30 BC. Now, the series was never made commercially available, and this copy, which the gentleman who's put them on YouTube uploaded, he said this copy is salvaged from a VHS of the original broadcast, which he taped while it was actually airing. And he says it's the only record of John's excellent and atmospheric documentary series that I've found. And I got to tell you, it's everything that everybody says it is, and for a couple of reasons. And I actually have a few audio sound bites that I want to share with you guys. Have either of you happened to watch this yet?
No, this is news to me, but it sounds very interesting.
Well, I got to say, it's kind of like with those old TV shows. Some of them are kind of fringy and weird, like In Search Of, but I mean, I grew up watching shows like that, and I love that stuff. And my favorite episodes of In Search Of, in fact, were usually the ones that had to do with historical mysteries, rather than the more paranormal kind of stuff. But this is a show kind of from that same era, with this quaint Egyptologist who's taking you into the tombs and doing all this stuff. But it's so funny because Romer's got this real kind of funny sense of humor, and he talks about things, talks about how cool the Egyptians were. But then the music is so intense. And an example of some of the music that they actually feature, and I've got it linked on our show notes right there, De Natura Sonoris No. 1, Polish National Radio Symphony Orchestra performing this. It's by Krzysztof Penderecki, Threnody to the Victims of Hiroshima. Anyway, it's very intense music, but they play this, and I've got some audio sound bites I want to share. First and foremost, as the show kicks off, the music sets the mood so perfectly. Anyway, the weird little trills and stuff, I mean, the music is just very... I don't know, there's something about it. You just don't see stuff like this on the modern Egyptological TV shows. But Romer himself, listen to him describing the cool image that the Egyptians left of themselves.
The ancient Egyptians have deliberately left us with a cool image of themselves. Ancient Egypt in its Sunday best. It's very difficult to see these people as living flesh and blood. When every now and again you get just a little chink in the curtain. There's certainly one here. I'll read you a bit of a story. It says, one day the king was sad, so he assembled the officers of his palace in order to seek for him a diversion, but he found none. And then he said, go bring me the scribe of the book, Jar Jar Emank is a wise man, you see. And he was brought straight away. And his majesty said unto him, I have assembled the officers of the palace together in order to seek a diversion, but I could find none. He's the biggest man in Egypt, but he's still sad.
I love that. I mean, he puts it in such an interesting context. He's the biggest man in Egypt, but he's still sad. And on that's from the second episode of the show. But a little later, they have another narrator who comes in, and they'll show these really enigmatic shots of Romer, often in silhouette, walking through some of the tombs and things like this. I can't place him, but it's a famous British narrator who reads some of the actual historical records from Egypt, and I've got a little of that, but some of the very intense music that's featured behind it. It's such an interesting interplay of elements, and I have to say it's really one of the, like the Redditor said, it's one of the best documentaries of its kind that I've ever heard.
If you take as a concubine one who is happy, known in the town, if she is fickle and lives for the moment, then don't send her away, but make her fat with eating. Joyful ones bring happiness. A man whose belly is empty is an accuser.
I mean, that intense music and the swells, of the symphony and everything, and then it'll have like Romer walk by in silhouette, and it's just wow, what an almost unknown treasure had it not been. I mean, the treasure in itself, which is actually discussing the treasures of Egypt, and salvaged from an actual aired copy taped to VHS in 1982, and someone uploaded it to YouTube. Check it out.
Yeah, that whole feeling that it seems to have and describe it. It's one of the reasons that I love movies, horror movies, old Hammer films, and old European horror movies from the 60s and the 70s and even the early 80s, because they all had that type of music and that same type of feel that created that atmosphere. And so it's something I think is greatly lacking in modern day cinema. But that's one of the reasons I have such a passion for those old films from the 60s and 70s. They have a completely different vibe, completely different feel to them.
Oh, they totally do. And something I'll say is that at first the music seemed so weird and out of place. It was so dark and so tempestuous. But I'm looking at the comments on YouTube, and people are like, wow, man, the music really adds something to it. And although some people would playfully kind of refer to it as being over the top or even pompous, I think it did something completely different, again, from what most documentary series on that subject managed to do. And it wasn't Egyptian music per se. We named one of the pieces, and again, it's just a very interesting kind of almost a clash, and yet so harmonious in the way that it put this very dark, archaic sense of energy behind everything that was being read and shown on the screen. Wow, Romer's Egypt. I would love to see, I don't know if John Romer is still alive. If he is, and if he's around, I would love to talk to him sometime. That's all I have to say about that. But guys, maybe you followed really quickly. I'll just interject this since we're talking about Egypt. There's been some news out of Egypt right now, and Archaeology magazine reported on this, and I actually went over to Aram Online, where the full story was carried. A relief of King Amenhotep I recovered from London. Okay, and I'm looking at an image of the cartouche of this right now. According to the article, the Ministry of Antiquities' mission to recover stolen and illegally smuggled antiquities has successfully seen the repatriation of a relief with the cartouche of King Amenhotep I. A supervisor general of antiquities of the repatriation department, Shabad Abel Gawad, explained to Aram Online that the relief was first noticed by a foreign archaeologist a few months ago when it was put on sale in an auction hall in London. Gawad said that the archaeologist realized that the relief is the same one that was stolen in 1988 from the open-air museum in Karnak Temple complex in Luxor, as the relief is carved in limestone and features the name of King Amenhotep I. The archaeologist then promptly reported the incident to the Ministry of Antiquities. The ministry then took all necessary legal and diplomatic procedures to stop the sale of the relief and return it to Egypt. The relief, Abdel Gawad said, was handed over to the Egyptian embassy in London yesterday and is set to come home within a few days. So it will be making its way back to its country of origin. But in the broader context of repatriation, guys, this is something I've been thinking about, because there's a move among some, especially in the Antiquities Ministry in Egypt, that they would like to have a lot of their artifacts brought back to them, which now reside in Britain. And of course, throughout the 18th and 19th century, in the antiquarian movement, Giovanni Belzoni and guys like that we've talked about in the past on the program, they were instrumental in retrieving some of the lost treasures of ancient Egypt and then getting them to Britain, where they made their way to collectors first, and now many are housed in museums. But the question is, should they necessarily go home to Egypt? I mean, of course, I guess British authorities would like to keep what they have. Is it safer in Britain? That's a question also, considering some of the turmoil in the Middle East and in parts of Egypt and North Africa right now. So I guess all these things are questions. Where do the artifacts belong? I mean, they belong to the Egyptians, but how likely is it that they will indeed be repatriated?
Well, this is this has been going on for many years, and just as we talk about the British Museum, some would say, well, look at World War II when London was being bombed, and, were they any safer at that point in history?
Good point.
And so, again, we've just lost the National Museum in Brazil due to that terrible fire. So it's hard to say, once they've been taken out of the ground, once they've been placed into a museum collection, are they ever really going to be safe? A lot of times the argument is, well, we can't leave them in situ because they're going to be looted, they're going to be stolen, they're going to be destroyed by floods, by volcanoes, by other natural phenomena. But if we take them out, we place them into a museum system, are they any safer? And another huge issue that we see is a lot of times these artifacts, most of what you actually is in the collection is not on display for you to see. It's in an archive, and sometimes it's years, 20, 30, 40, 50 years before some of these boxes are ever opened to even be examined to see what's in them when they're being extracted from an archaeological site. So then, again, what are the condition of the artifacts? Are they being stored properly? These are all things that we could talk about for hours, but who knows, but there has been a call for quite a few years of Egypt wanting to bring those artifacts home, especially with the looming grand opening of the brand new museum there in Cairo.
Absolutely. Well, with regard to repatriation of artifacts, more generally, this has to do, of course, with items that have been looted or stolen and them making their way back to their rightful home. And there's a great website for that, which is called the antiquitiescoalition.org. They've got a lot of information about repatriating the past. In fact, I've got an article right here, Filling the Holes in Egypt's History Left by Looting, and that by Katie A. Paul with the Antiquities Coalition.
So as we move the calendar a little bit further back in time, we'll find ourselves back in North America, and in the brand new issue of American Archaeology magazine, this is the fall 2018 edition that's out right now. There's a fantastic new article in there by Tamara Yeager Stewart called Of Mastodons and Men. And this is real important to the Seven Ages team because, as we all know, we're pretty obsessed with the peopling of America, and we have some really interesting new pre-Clovis as well as Clovis information being relayed in this article. So what it's talking about is the presence of pre-Clovis stone tools along with megafaunal remains being found down at the Aucilla Springs. Now, this particular area is well known for pre-Clovis. It's in the same general region as the Page Ladson site that we've talked about quite a bit in the past. And so this particular river drainage, the Aucilla River drainage in north central Florida, it's kind of home to millennia worth of folks coming there hunting and living in that area. Again, as we refer to the Page Ladson site, it's well known to be a pre-Clovis site, and that's what they continue to be finding there. So at this particular area, there's an upwelling known as Aucilla Springs. Currently, it contains countless amounts of Pleistocene animals, all sorts of different things that they're finding as far as fossilizations and record or bones and different remains of these animals in this particular waterway. These waterways also include pre-Clovis sites. Now, some of these are dating back to 14,500 years. Again, that's about the same range that we see with Page Ladson. In addition, there's numerous Mastodon and Paleoindian discoveries that's being found in this area. It's being headed up right now by Jim Dunbar, who's a name that probably sounds familiar to some of you if you followed any of the Page Ladson excavations and some of the other work that's been done in that particular area. As we move forward with the research, he'll be working with C. Andy Hemmings again. Now, this team's down there conducting research right now. The new hotbed, if you will, is called the Aucilla Springs Lodge site, and that's going to be located in what's known as the Edward Ball Aucilla Springs State Park. So that's where they're currently working. This 6,000-acre park is part of the Aucilla Springs Archaeological and Historical District. So that's actually a National Register of Historic Places. So if you're down there, observing the excavations, it's kind of a whole entire complex that you can go and see. But what's being found there is really interesting to the research that we do here at Seven Ages. Since the early 19th century, there's been numerous mastodons found and recovered in that spring area. It includes one of the earliest known underwater archaeological recoveries of mastodon bones. This was undertaken way back in 1850 by a Philadelphia naturalist named George King. All right, he did this with grappling hooks and ropes back in the day, but I guess you do the best with what you have.
And he liked it.
Yeah, he did, right? We'll never know, I guess. The remains of two other mastodons, though, they've been found and recovered in that general area prior to 1916. So we fast forward a little bit to 1995. Then we see archaeologist Calvin Jones. He's located a pre-Clovis site containing stone tools just west of that area on a sandy terrace, very near a spring hit. So we know, that would be a perfect place in paleo time for people to be coming. That particular site is now known as the Aucilla Lodge site. Okay, so in there they're finding tools. This included a large knife, a small lancelet point. These are the sorts of items that were found at the Page Ladson site that we've discussed previously. Now in 2015 and 2016, Dunbar and his crew, they've conducted a series of post-hole tests. This led to the identification of several new sites within that area. And so then the following year, they began a major excavation in the western portion of the Aucilla Springs Lodge site. At that site, the team discovered a knife with some Clovis-like features. about 3 feet down in a pit. Okay. And below that level, they found additional manufacturing debris. You know, we always say here, dig deeper, right? Well, more and more archaeological sites, whether it be Galt out in Texas, whether we be this site in Florida, it seems that people are finally starting to dig deeper. In the fall of 2017, additional testing revealed similar artifacts as well as a Paleoindian lozenge-shaped point in that area. So this is something that I'm very, very interested in. I would actually like to be able to get down there at some point in the future on one of our expeditions and see if we can't learn more about this, maybe interview some of the people involved. But just as Page Latson, just as Topper, just as many of these other sites that are being discovered over the years, I think this may end up being a very important site. Again, as they're doing these test pits and digging more, we're beginning to find more and more of this very, very early pre-Clovis and Clovis remains. So it should definitely be one to keep an eye on.
James, I think I'm starting to see what he was talking about, because, you know, leading up to time to record tonight, he was like, I'm not going to get into it right now, but I mean, I've got some stuff. I got some thoughts. This is the thing that kind of, I came away from my own trip out west with one, because again, I was out there looking at all the archaeology I could possibly take in, and I went to the Vor Buffalo Jump, as it's called, and I kept asking, you know, what are there Paleo-Indian points out here? And they said, no, this is just a few hundred years old. There's so much more evidence of more recent cultural manifestation out there in the Western lands, and I saw very little in the way of Paleo-Indian artifacts. Not to say that there aren't some, but, you know, in contrast to that, I'm looking over here at the projectile point sequence from South Carolina, the same one that's on the wall behind you, James, in your office there. This, of course, provided by our good friend, Dr. Christopher Moore. And I'm looking at all the different Paleo-Indian projectile points that are represented in the Southeast and how often these things turn up. And I'm just thinking one thing. I mean, there seems to be a preponderance of earlier human habitation in the Southeastern United States. And we keep finding sites like this. And the one that you mentioned there, Jason, the Page Latson site, just to let you guys know, if you look on our Instagram account, 7 Ages Research, there are some cool pictures of Jason and I and James while we're actually listening to John Ladson, the owner of that property and one of the people for whom the site is named. We attended a lecture in Georgia that he gave talking about the history of that site. And again, there is a preponderance of evidence, not only of pre-Clovis presence in North America, but so much of it does seem to be kind of focused on the southern United States and southern North America in general, if you look at sites in Mexico like El Fin del Mundo and things like that. Now, there are other sites northerly oriented, like Bluefish Caves in Alaska, as would be expected with a potential land bridge right there, the Bering Land Bridge. But again, I think that as we're seeing the unfolding narrative of ancient human migrations into North America and all throughout different parts of the ancient world, the story's very different from what I think we once expected it would be, and it's not as clear-cut, and it's not a single story of one migration from one direction into another. It seems to be all over the place. But, I mean, again, I'm kind of taken, Jason, with the preponderance of information that seems to show this occupation in the southeastern United States, and there's a lot of evidence that's really pointing in that direction, isn't there?
Yeah, there really is. And, you know, it seems like we keep getting, you know, granted, a lot of these discoveries are spaced out over decades, but we keep running into these really, really, you know, far back, deep into antiquity sites. I mean, Cactus Hill in Virginia, Topper, even Meadowcroft up in Pennsylvania, and now Page Latson, this Wakulla Springs site. I mean, it just keeps going on and on. These really ancient sites keep popping up and making themselves known. And as the research continues, especially around an area like we see in Florida, where there are the presence of so many springs and so many areas that would have been, you know, perfect for early people migrating across that area, it's really intriguing. And I think that's a hotbed that we need to keep our eye on in the future.
So many mysteries and marvels of the ancient past. Hey, speaking of mysteries and marvels, the guys and I are going to be hitting the road here in just a few weeks. I cannot wait for the 7 Ages field trip, October 2018, the 8th through the 12th of October this year. We're going to be hitting a number of the ancient Mississippian mound sites in Georgia and Alabama, catching up with our good friend Randall Carlson for dinner, and finally, we are going to meet the Raging Cajun himself from the LaRue Bayou of WCW and WWE fame, Lash LaRue, former pro wrestler and good friend of the program. We're going to be catching up with him on our trip, and I hope indeed that we're going to be able to learn as much as we possibly can. Our little 7 Ages field trips are a lot of fun. I know one thing too, guys. Next time I go to Devil's Tower, I think I got to bring James Waldo and Jason Pentrail with me so that you guys can experience that with me. And hey, if you guys want to experience some of our adventures on the road, whether we are together or not, or we are separated by many miles, but nonetheless continuing our survey of human history and our ancient past, you can head over to YouTube and check out 7 Ages Research. James Waldo diligently puts up every episode of this podcast there on our YouTube page. And of course, we've also got videos, including a short documentary about our trip to the very interesting Topper archaeological site by the Savannah River. We had the good fortune of visiting there with Dr. Albert Goodyear. You can also check us out on Instagram, check us out on Twitter, and you can find us on Facebook as well. And don't forget 7ages.org for articles and all of the aforementioned. You can find it all right there on the website. Now, when we come back, okay, I think we've all had enough fun, and as we tend to do here in the Cross Time Pub, somebody slips up and has to eat their own words, but throughout different times in history, people have had to eat more than that. In fact, during times of famine and sometimes warfare and other peculiar instances of the human condition, there is an unusual element of humanity. Anthropophagy, as an anthropologist might call it, but for the layman, we'll just refer to it as cannibalism. And we're going to look at some of the stark instances where it occurred in the Old West and throughout history when we return here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Recently on 7 Ages, we've been exploring some of the areas of anthropology and archaeology that we feel have kind of been overlooked in the historical record. Our last episode, we focused on the art of ancient tattooing, and this week we tackle the topic of cannibalism. This is, something I've always heard about. I've heard about it in different, myths and legends, but when you really start digging into it and find out the little intricate details, it really is quite fascinating and in sort of a macabre and dark way. That is part of the human condition, and there are many instances, much more than I realized, where cannibalism has taken place. So anthropologists and archaeologists actually divide cannibalism into 6 major categories. I found these fascinating, and I want to get into a few of those now. So first one, Indo-cannibalism. So this is referring to the consumption of members of one's own group. So that would be like the 7 Ages team here. Hopefully we never get to that point. They keep the Cross Time Pub pretty well stocked. But that's when you're dealing with someone of your own family lineage, someone of your own group, and it's referred to as Indo-cannibalism. So the next stage of that is called Exo Cannibalism, and that's simply referring to the consumption of outsiders. So anyone outside of your tribe or your group, maybe an opposing tribe from a further distance, whatever it may be. Then we start getting into the more detailed forms on this list. So mortuary cannibalism is the next. Now this takes place at funerary rites. It can be practiced, as some would describe, as a form of affection for some particular cultures. Oftentimes it's seen as an act of renewal or reproduction. So all of those factors are kind of brought into the fold when you're talking about mortuary cannibalism. It can be something that's very meaningful to a particular group of people, and there's many, many different traditions concerning this throughout time and throughout the world. Then, of course, one that obviously made sense to me was warfare cannibalism. So the consumption of one's enemies. This can obviously show that you're exhibiting power over a defeated tribe. But another side to that I found really interesting was the fact that oftentimes warfare cannibalism can be a sign of honor to a brave person, a warrior who you held in high regard, who just happened to be considered an enemy as well. So oftentimes you could consume that person that you had a great affection for. So I found that part of the warfare aspect of this to be really interesting. Then, as we'll be discussing as the night goes on, the term survival cannibalism. Now, I think this is probably what most people would associate with the term. Simply, the consumption of weaker individuals, whether they're the very young or the very old, those who are sickly. We're dealing with a military siege, you're dealing with a shipwreck, you're dealing with famine, those type of situations where you have no other choice, there is no other food source, so you simply have to survive. And I think when most people consider cannibalism, unless you're really talking about a serial killer or something like that, which is a completely different thing, I think most people would associate survival cannibalism with the term. Now, there are some less studied categories, which I found equally as interesting, one of which was medicinal cannibalism. This is different cultures who believe that the ingestion of human flesh can be used for medical purposes, whatever those purposes may be within that culture. One that I've never thought about, but I've seen people do often, is auto-cannibalism, and that's eating your hair, eating your fingernails, things like that. Never really considered that to be cannibalism, but apparently it made the list. But out of all of these, guys, I think the one that I find the most disturbing is what's known as innocent cannibalism. This is when a person is simply unaware that they are consuming human flesh.
Oh, there is a Hannibal Lecter connection. I knew it.
There always is. You can't miss that. So you can imagine what type of situation you may find yourself in when you would be consuming human flesh unknowingly. And I can only imagine that would be quite traumatic, finding that out on the backside of that conversation.
You knew that barbecue tasted funny.
Yeah, but now what's interesting is that reminds me of something. Of course, the Lycaean myth, King Lycaean, of the Greek mythologies. According to the Bibliotheca, Lycaean sired 50 sons and many wives, and his sons were the most nefarious and carefree of all people in that part of the world at that time. And so to test them, the great Greek god Zeus visited. He came in the form of a peasant. This is kind of a trope that you see throughout different world mythologies. And what apparently they did was they mixed the entrails of a child into the god's meal, whereupon Zeus became highly pissed off and threw over the table with the meal. And then he essentially, as Lycaean, flees. Some of the stories go that he is killed with a bolt of lightning, but in a lot of popular renditions of the myth, as Lycaean runs, he is transformed into a wolf. Okay? And so we have, of course, the etymological underpinnings of lycanthropy, which is associated with werewolves. But there's also this idea, again, I've looked into this a lot. I've never been to Greece, but I mean, the archaeology and history of Greece is fascinating to me. And anthropological studies indicate that there was, at one time, a festival, that was held in honor of this tradition. And there are a lot of weird mythologies associated with it. One that had entailed that a boxing man came and while he was fighting, he actually transmogrified into a wolf. Another story tells that there was a tradition of mixing entrails of an animal, presumably not an actual human, but it was to at very least represent human entrails, in with a stew that all of these men in a kind of, young men in a coming-of-age ceremony would consume, with the idea being sort of representative of this broader mythology involving the entrails of a child being served to Zeus and it enraging him. So there's a cannibalistic link in that history and mythology of ancient Greece, too, which has an interesting connection with the mythology of werewolves. I always thought that was neat, too.
Yeah, that actually is very interesting. I didn't know that about that link to werewolves, though. I learned something tonight.
Yeah, it does happen from time to time when people listen to this podcast. But, also speaking about the etymological underpinnings of some of this stuff, and James, this kind of gets into your realm of study and what you're looking at in relation to this, too, with regard to Native American legends about this. But the actual etymology of the word cannibal, apparently, comes from Columbus's reports from his second voyage to the Caribbean in 1493. He goes there, he meets the Taino people, and he uses this word to refer to Caribs in the Antilles who were identified as eaters of human flesh. And so the connection with colonialism is not a coincidence. They say social discourse about cannibalism within a European or Western tradition is much older, but almost always as an institution among other cultures. People who eat people need or deserve to be subjugated, which brings us into the idea of politically motivated or derogatory or ethnic stereotypes pertaining to cannibalism. And the idea that in the historical record, people would identify others as savages and say that they were cannibals is a way to try and subjugate or make them seem less than human. And if you look at wood cuttings, post-Columbian especially, of people from the New World, often what you see represented is, a chief standing there, and he may have his wife and the children gathered around her, and then you'll see the body parts of an enemy strewn about being cooked over a fire or something like that. But he nonetheless uses that term, and that seems to be, at least in terms of how we use the term today and know it and recognize it, that seems to be the origin of that word.
Very interesting. In doing the research for this show tonight, I came across this paper on Ohio University's website by David Scheinman, and it deals with cannibalism with the Northeastern Native American tribes and their interaction with the French and the English when they first came over. So the name of the article is Adoption or Entree, and I'm just going to read the first few paragraphs of this because it's just really, really interesting. Of all the North American Indian tribes, the 17th century Iroquois are the most renowned for their cruelty towards other human beings. Scholars know that they tortured war prisoners and that they were cannibals. In the Algonquin tongue, the word Mohawk actually means flesh eater. There is even a story that the Indians in the neighboring Iroquois territory would flee their home upon sight of just a small band of Mohawks. Ironically, the Iroquois were not alone in these practices. There is ample evidence that most, if not all, of the Indians of northeastern America engaged in cannibalism and torture. There is documentation of the Huron, Neutral, and Algonquin tribes, each exhibiting the same behavior. First, a bit of background is necessary to understand the state of the Native American people before colonial exploration and settlement. The Iroquois were the dominant force in the northeastern America until the Europeans came to the New World. 5 smaller nations made up the League of the Iroquois, and they were the Onondaga, Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, and Seneca tribes. The legendary Hiawatha joined these 5 tribes together in a single powerful confederation after fierce blood feuds threatened to destroy all 5 nations. The date of the League's formation could be any time between 900 AD and 1570. The confederation was certainly established before European settlers made first contact. Based upon Hiawatha's plan, members of each nation could only marry members of other Iroquois nations. These blood ties formed a web of loyalties between the different tribes. Most of what scholars know about the Iroquois comes from European accounts. These negative views result because Europeans settling in North America first came to encounter the Huron, Narragansett, and Algonquin tribes, who were enemies of the Iroquois. These tribes had become oppressed by the Iroquois nations after they had formed their confederation. Prior to the League, these 3 tribes were actually the dominant Native Americans in the Northeast. Later, these tribes were also among the first to accept Catholicism, which added favor in the eyes of the French. When the Europeans accepted the friendship of these tribes, however, they accepted the enmity of the Iroquois as well. I'm sure they didn't know that. It's also important to establish that these practices of the Iroquois were more than the exaggeration or hearsay of excitable Frenchmen. The Iroquois surely performed torture upon war captives. Many European settlers viewed firsthand the mutilated body parts of war captives. However, there has been some doubt in the current century that cannibalism was really practiced by the Iroquois. Anthropologist W. Ahrens proposed in 1979 that there were no firsthand accounts of flesh eating among the Native Americans, and thus no solid proof of cannibalism. This controversial view has been refuted since, where there is indeed ample evidence in the Jesuit relations and Allied documents alone to prove Ahrens' thesis wrong. With this assertion in mind, it is now possible to inquire why the Native Americans performed these appalling acts. The death of a family member had a profound psychological effect upon the Iroquois. Thus, they required strong measures to relieve themselves of sadness. Especially, they felt that they needed restitution in some form or another for the dead relative. Grieving matriarchs petitioned the tribe's warriors to retrieve captives from an offending tribe. The Iroquois warriors then established a raid solely to gather captives. Scholars call this practice mourning wars. Mourning not as in that time of day,
Right.
but as in sadness.
Yeah.
According to Anthony Wallace, the grieving Iroquois could find restitution in one of 3 ways. The first was for a warrior to bring back the scalp of an Indian from the killer's tribe and to present it to the grieving person. Though the scalp represented a captive, live prisoners were preferred. The other 2 options involved a live captive. The Iroquois either vengefully tortured the prisoner to death or adopted him or her into the tribe. Since the Iroquois were a matriarchal society, the mourning woman would ultimately decide the fate of those captives that were brought to the village, mostly based upon the amount of grief that she felt for her dead relation. Bartholomew Beaumont presented a harrowing example of Iroquois torture that occurred in 1642 in the Jesuit Relations and Allied documents. In this account, he told of an Iroquois war band that captured a small group of Algonquin and himself. Immediately, the Iroquois cut off a few fingers from each captive using fish scales. The Iroquois intended to take the captives to their village. On the way, the Algonquin woman, realizing what her fate would be, ran into an icy river and drowned herself rather than face the impending torture. Once they had arrived at their captor's village, the Iroquois made their prisoners sing and dance upon a scaffold. Valmont's companion, a converted Algonquin named Adrian, wouldn't sing in the Iroquois language, and they split his fingers lengthwise to cause him intense pain. Next, they cleared the scaffold except for one Algonquin named, this is an impossible name to pronounce, but it's Iwesnippin, and they began burning his body with brands. The Iroquois forced an Algonquin woman to take a torch and burn Iwesnippin, and then killed her when she finally complied. Throughout this entire ordeal, the Algonquin man showed no pain. They continued this torture throughout the night, building to a fervor, finally ending at sunrise by cutting his scalp open, forcing sand into the wound, and dragging his mutilated body around the camp. When they had finished, the Iroquois carved up and ate parts of his body.
Okay, so that's a historical reference to cannibalism in a ritual sense, performed on the enemy. And, I have read a lot of that kind of thing. Jason, is that referenced in Bound's book that we've been reading on the mounds?
Honestly, I don't know.
I can't keep up with all the history books that we're all reading at all times,
Yeah, I have a stack of them here.
Yeah, we've all got stacks and stacks. I mean, if you're like me, you need a bigger house just to be able to keep all the books. But anyway, point being that this seems to fall under the categorization of a kind of ritual cannibalism that you were talking about, Jason, there, or warfare cannibalism, which also involves the consumption of the enemies. Now, you add to that another layer, which is also the mutilation and torture of your enemies. And many cultures, ladies and gents, have practiced that over time. They absolutely have.
Yeah, and while many of these legends, you could say, or things that have been attributed to indigenous people of North America, some of them may be provable, some of them may be, just legends. However, I ran across an article, it's a bit dated, a few years ago, referring to Jamestown, Virginia, where they have actually proved cannibalism did seem to take place there. So I'll just touch on this here for a moment. But there were actually 6 different accounts from Jamestown. Now, Jamestown was the first permanent English colony in the New World, and as we all know, it was quite hard to establish and to maintain that colony. And there were cannibalism episodes described from that time period in Jamestown. Actually, one was described by former Jamestown President George Percy, who wrote in 1625 that during the 1609 to 1610 winter, that caused mass starvation among the 300 settlers that were there at Jamestown, George Percy writes, "Nothing was spared to maintain life, as to dig up dead corpses out of graves and eat them." Now, William Kelso, an archaeologist with the Preservation Virginia, who had been excavating Jamestown since 1994, he doubted Percy's descriptions. He was like, it was probably just legend, until his team found the butchered skull of a 14-year-old girl that was buried in a trash pit, along with the remains of dogs and horses. Now, other sources of food for these desperate colonists would have been horses, dogs, anything that they could have found in the area to eat. They were that desperate at the time. And apparently this 14-year-old girl was among those bones in the trash pit. They call her Jane. Obviously, she's not known, but she was originally thought to have been an upper-class settler, but the recent analysis found her skeleton had very low lead levels, which showed them that she most likely wasn't, because the rich in Jamestown were eating from pewtered dishes and were basically giving themselves lead poisoning.
Oh, interesting.
So through those forensics, they were able to establish sort of her pecking order in the things as far as where she was in that, basically what you could call a caste system of the time. And being that she was found among the debris and trash with the other bones, it seems that because she maybe wasn't at the top of that list, she was used as a food source.
Wow.
I was thinking as you were, we're talking about the harsh winters that they endured. Coincidentally, that was during the Little Ice Age.
Oh.
And the winters were much, much more severe in North America and in Europe than they are now. So, that was probably not the best time to try to colonize the New World, but I guess they eventually made it stick.
The famous Little Ice Age, referenced also as Washington and the boys were crossing the Delaware. If you look at the historical record and when they were crossing, why in the world would the river still be frozen at that time? Well, it's because they were coming out of that Little Ice Age, I think also called the Maunder Minimum. But as we look at this chronological survey of cannibalism in the New World, another one, probably one of the more famous and curious instances of all history, involves the so-called Donner Party. And I'll reference right now from the Mojave County Miner, December 30th, 1921. a story that was featured in the Friday edition. Death of Last Survivor recalls tragic story of Donner Party. Now, I just got to preface this by saying I have such a love for combing the old newspapers and trying to find, and again, you can go to chroniclingamerica.loc.gov, okay? And this is part of the Library of Congress's effort to chronicle newspapers going all the way back to the 1700s. But I mean, you can look at so much and you can learn so much about history if you search the archives there. This is a story that was published, again, that tells the story according to one of the last survivors of the story of the Donner Party. And I think we'll begin with this portion of the story here. San Francisco, December 14th. The recent death at Byron, California, of Mrs. Frances E. Wilder, a daughter of Captain George Donner, has recalled the tragic story of the Donner Party, 42 of whom died in deserts and mountains during the winter of 1846 and 1847, while en route to California. Only a half dozen survivors remain today to tell the tale of that most disastrous of all migrations of the Argonauts, in which they participated as children. Now, among these half dozen are three sisters of Mrs. Wilder, children of the captain from whom the party took its name. They are Mrs. Eliza P. Houghton of Los Angeles. She's 78 at the time this article was published in 1921. Okay, Mrs. Leanna App of Jamestown, California, aged 86, and then Miss Elitha C. Wilder of Bruceville, California, who was the eldest of the three at 89. Now, a daughter of James F. Reed, a member of the party who forced his way over the snow-capped Sierra Mountains and then returned with relief for his dying companions, is living in Capitola, California. Her name is Mrs. Mattie Lewis, and she is a bright-eyed lady, 77 years young. Of all the companies that made their way over land, desert, and mountain to California before the railroad linked east with west, the experiences of the Donner Party were the worst. Theirs was the greatest loss of life, and it was attended by a slow starvation during the 6 months that they were held in the high Sierras that finally drove the stronger members of the party to that last expedient of man, feeding upon his own kind. Of the 88 men, women, and children that started with or joined the Donner Party, 42 perished, 6 died in the deserts of Utah and Nevada, and 36 succumbed to the horrors of the mountain camps. All the suffering and loss of life may be ascribed to the primary mistake in taking a southerly course around the Great Salt Lake from Fort Bridger, Wyoming, instead of using the usual course around the northern end. The rocky passes of the Wasatch Mountains in Utah delayed them 1 month. The sands of the Great American Desert and the Humboldt Sink stalled their wagons and starved their cattle. The party was in starving condition when it reached Truckee Meadows, site of the present-day city of Reno, Nevada, on October 19, 1846. The immigrants were met there by Charles T. Stanton, who had preceded them to California and returned with 2 Indians, Luis and Salvador, bringing 5 mule loads of provisions. After some delay, the party pushed on, but October 23rd found themselves stalled in snow at the foot of precipices at an elevation of 6,000 feet from which the trail rose in 1 mile and a half, 12,000 feet to the summit, where 2 to 5 feet of snow lay. They were in a pocket of the mountains. A snowfall began, that in a week placed 10 feet of snow about them. So first and foremost, step aside in your mind here for a moment and imagine being stuck in an area of the mountains like this, and snow is piling up by the foot around you. Okay, you're already low on supplies. Everyone's cold and hungry. Some were at Prosser Creek, some at Alder Creek, and some at Donner Lake as it's known today. They erected tents and brushwood huts, about which they wrapped rubber coats and quilts. There were at this time 81 persons in the camps, 24 men, 16 women, and the greatest number of all, 43 children. In the subsequent happenings, the women showed the greater courage and endurance. Of the 15, only 5 died, and 4 of these gave their lives to aid or comfort their children or companions. On December 16th, the forlorn hope started over the snow on foot. It consisted of 9 men, 5 women, and a boy. 6 days later, Stanton, the rescuer, gave out and was abandoned. A storm that began Christmas Day halted them a week. 3 men died and were eaten. January 4th, another man succumbed and was also eaten. William Foster pursued and shot the Indians, Luis and Salvador, who were then eaten. The party came out of the snow January 1st, were aided by Indians who gave them acorn bread and helped them to Johnson's Rancho. They had been 32 days coming from Donner's Lake, and 8 had died. 2 men survived, and all 5 of the women. But the story doesn't end there. The experience of the 4 relief parties, from the first that left Sutter's Fort February 5th to the last on April 13th, were similar to those of the Forlorn Hope Party. going in on their return trips. In several instances, these caches were destroyed by wild animals so that the return trips with the emaciated, weakened Donner Party became struggles with death, in which many died and were eaten by their starving companions. The fourth and last relief party started from Johnson's Rancho April 13th. They had been promised by the alcalde half of the fortune of several $1,000s in money and goods which George Donner was supposed to possess. The 7 men of the party under William O. Palin reached Donner Lake in 4 days. Louis Kessberg was the only one alive of the many who had not been able to accompany the relief parties who had preceded them. Of Kessberg, the relief men demanded money, accusing him of having robbed, killed, and eaten George Donner and his wife, Tamsin. Kessberg finally gave them $500, which he said Mrs. Donner had requested him give to her children should he reach California. The fourth relief started back the next day. Kessberg followed them as well as he could with an injured leg. Each night he managed to make camp and finally reached civilization. To the end of his life, he was an object of accusation and aversion, although most survivors and historians agree that he was in fact innocent. The brightest part of the story was the heroism of the women. Of the 5 who died, Mrs. Donner gave her life to be with her husband at his death. Mrs. Jacob Donner remained with her 4 children. Mrs. Graves stayed for the sake of 4 little ones, and Mrs. Murphy cared for her son and 3 grandchildren until too ill to accompany the rescuers. Anyway, that in essence is the story of the Donner Party, but again, it's one of the most peculiar episodes in history, and many historians have said it was, in terms of something that happened in the U.S., and probably the best-known instance of cannibalism in the Old West. But again, I want to reference really quickly an article by Mark McLaughlin, in the Tahoe Weekly, this from 2017, so just last year. And the article's titled Bones of Contention, Donner Party Archaeology. Okay, now we know the story already. I want to look at what the archaeology has to say about this. And I quote in part from the article, "The scientists involved in this ongoing study did not claim that cannibalism did not occur, but here's what they did find. The analysis of a small sampling of tiny bone fragments, only 30 out of about 16,000 pieces that were tested, did not turn up any human bones, left a lot of questions for researchers. It didn't prove that the snowbound immigrants didn't resort to human flesh for food. Quite to the contrary, as we've already seen looking at some of the newspaper archives, the historical record does seem to indicate rather conclusively that cannibalism did occur at the Donner Lake campsite as well as at Alder Creek. However, the media did seem to jump on this, setting the stage for even more confusion and misinformation, because when they analyzed the animal bones, they found no evidence of humans being consumed. So the media ran with it and said, hey, looks like there wasn't cannibalism after all. One of the greatest stories in American history pertaining to cannibalism was actually mythology. It really probably wasn't quite the case. I continue with the article from the Tahoe Weekly. Archaeological research at the Donner encampments has been an ongoing process for more than a century. It started with Charles McGlashan in the 1870s. He was an amateur but thorough Truckee historian who wrote the first comprehensive book on the subject. His endeavor led to the establishment of the towering immigrant monument at Donner Memorial State Park. Now, if we go back in time to the 1990s, Dr. Donald Hardesty, a University of Nevada, Reno anthropologist, excavated the ground at the base of the iconic Donner tree at Alder Creek. It's fallen down, by the way, by now. But at that time, again, no evidence that anyone had camped there for a prolonged period of time in the mid-1800s was found. And the lack of physical evidence forced historians in the U.S. Forest Service to acknowledge that the revered tree associated with the famous incident didn't even indicate the location of one of the Donner campsites. Hardesty's crew expanded the search area, and with the help of a metal detector survey, they soon did discover 19th century human artifacts only about 200 yards away from that tree. Unfortunately, the economics of the situation ensued, and they ran out of money before they could complete the excavation. But there was a book written about this, The Archaeology of the Donner Party, published in 1997 by the University of Nevada Press. So you skip ahead to the new millennium, 2004 and 2005. And a team of anthropologists and forensic specialists, were looking at Hardesty's 1993 discovery at Alder Creek. They wanted to know, was it truly a campsite of one of the 2 Donner families? Now this was, I know that Dr. Kara Cooney, when she came on the show and talked with us, warned about history done for television, or archaeology done for television.
Right.
But the History Channel did fund this, And there had been a program that had aired previously on Discovery Channel called Unsolved History, the Donner Party. And so sometimes funding from television networks can actually, in a philanthropic way, if the right kinds of researchers and credited scientists, archaeologists, historians are involved, I mean, it can lead to further research and findings. So during this dig, the team discovered the remains of a hearth, an important find because it did suggest a longer-term stay. There was also a pipe bowl with fragments, tiny pieces of bone, including charred bone, lead balls of various sizes, and ceramic fragments. The artifacts, they say, were dated to the appropriate time period, and the evidence of a fire hearth led scientists to conclude that this was most likely a Donner family campsite. And they say further, and I quote, "It absolutely adds more credibility to the interpretation that this, rather than the famous tree, is where the Donner families camped." The artifacts they found are similar to what we found in 1990 and 1993. Now, part of the issue, though, is that if they haven't found direct evidence of human bone, then is there really evidence that people were consumed at the site? Well, I skip ahead to the very end of the article here. Of the nearly 16,000 bone fragments recovered at Alder Creek, virtually all of them are smaller than a human fingernail, guys. And most are just too small to study effectively with current technologies. DNA analysis, even now, right? DNA analysis is unavailable due to the breakdown on the bone material from temperature extremes, soil acidity, and a climate pattern of very wet or very dry conditions at the site. Maybe like the accumulation of large amounts of snow and then that snow melting as the spring thaw occurs. So scientists used scanning electron microscopes to study 30 of the larger pieces and search for human bones that might have been boiled, which would have been a pretty fair indicator of cannibalism, right? They were able to identify bones from horses, oxen, deer, dog, rabbits, and rodents. But again, they don't seem to find a whole lot of evidence of humans. Now, what they do say is that the variety of animal bones at the Alder Creek campsite suggests that the stranded pioneers there may have had more food available than previously thought. The anthropologists admit that based on the accounts that they had read, they expected to find human remains among those animal bones, but to claim that no cannibalism occurred at Alder Creek based on these results is a conclusion that many find premature. So, as far as what archaeology says about this arguably most famous instance of cannibalism in American history, there's very little archaeological evidence for it. But the historic record seems to say otherwise. And part of the reason why seems to be simply this. If the remains that one hopes to find are in part consumed, and keeping in mind that bone, although it may last the test of time, but it too can tend to be biodegradable over time, depending on what was done with those remains, you may not find evidence of cannibalism. But this story, guys, is very similar to another one, and that, of course, is the story of Alfred Packer. And I'm a little more familiar with that story, in truth, because of a famous musical that was made based on it. Are you guys familiar with Trey Parker and Matt Stone's Cannibal the Musical? Have you seen that?
No. I'm familiar with a lot of their work, but that one I have managed to miss.
Okay, so you can see the entire thing on YouTube, and I might link that in the show notes because it is a humorous and very irreverent musical based on the story of Alfred Packer. Alfred Packer was a prospector and kind of a ne'er-do-well, kind of a weird fella. Okay, he confessed to theft and also cannibalism. His story, in short order here, begins essentially in 1873. There's a guy named Bob McGrew, okay, and there's a party of 21 men. They all leave Provo, Utah. They're heading west searching for gold, and they want to try and, shoot for Breckenridge, Colorado. In January of 1874, the following year, the party meets Chief Ouray, okay, whose famous name at that time was White Man's Friend, okay? They meet him in Colorado, and the chief recommends that they postpone their expedition until spring. A hard winter is coming. Okay, well, some of the men decide to go ahead and bed down and wait for winter to pass. The rest of them, they're like, okay, no, we're going to go ahead and we're going to push on, right? So some of the guys continue on, and at this point, Alfred Packer tries to follow one of those groups, okay? This group apparently was led by a man by the name of O.D. Lausenheiser, okay? Alfred Packer attempts to follow this group, but Lausenheiser points a revolver at him and says, quote, if I see him, or if I see you, after they pass the point of the mountain, then there's going to be trouble. Well, so Packer returns to camp and decides I'm not going to go and see what he intends to do after we go over the mountain, brandishing a gun at me. But just a week later, 6 men, including Alfred Packer, take off, okay? And they decide that they're going to attempt to leave as well. Now, this famous group of men includes James Humphrey, Frank Reddy Miller, Shannon Wilson Bell, George California Noon, and a man named Israel Swan. Now, the original leader of the 20-man or 21-man group, Bob McGrew, he leads these guys a certain extent and then turns back. Okay, he helps unload their provisions and goes back to Ore's camp, where he's waiting out the winter with the rest of the guys. At this point, we don't know what happens. All we know is that on April 16th, 1874, Alfred Packer shows up again at Los Pinos Indian Agency near Gunnison. Okay? And there's a member of McGrew's original camp who sees him there and asks Packer, hey, what happened to the rest of your party? Where's Shannon Wilson Bell and the guys? Well, Packer says, rather than knowing what happened to them, that he simply got his feet wet and frozen and that they abandoned him. He claimed he was broke when he arrived back at civilization, so he sold the Winchester rifle that he had, okay, to a man, Major Downer. What a name, huh? Major Downer. He sells his rifle. Okay, that guy was the justice of the peace in town for $10 whole, and then he stays at the agency for a while, right? Well, so a little later, Packer wants to go back home to Pennsylvania, he says, and so he accompanies one of the men, Preston Nutter, and two other members who had been part of McGrew's original 21-man group. Okay, and while they're en route, Nutter is watching Packer, and he feels like there's something that's not jiving right about this guy. First thing he notices about Packer is that he's got this knife, a skinning knife, right? And he recognizes this knife. He knows for a fact that it had belonged to a guy, Frank Reddy Miller, one of the 5 that had been with Packer for a total of 6, all of whom supposedly vanished, all of whom Packer says abandoned him when his feet got wet and frozen, right? And they abandoned him. Well, if they'd abandoned him, Nutter's asking, how in the heck did Alfred Packer end up with his knife? So anyway, the group makes their way to Saguache, Colorado. And they continue to notice weird behavior on part of Packer while they're there. For example, okay, they make arrangements to stay in Larry Dolan's saloon. They had rooms upstairs, like a lot of the old saloons. The owner then claimed that they watched Alfred Packer spend about $100 during the course of his stay. Now, keep in mind, that was a fair amount of money back in those days, considering that he sold a Winchester rifle for $10. While they're staying there at this saloon, he spends $100 over the course of his stay. And they also say that Packer offered to lend one of the other men $300. How much money has this guy got? It's like he's made of money all of a sudden. They say Packer spent $78 in a general store there in town. Nutter and other members of McGrew's original party at this point are starting to really get suspicious. They say, why does Alfred Packer have all this money? Why does he have that knife that belonged to one of the former members of his party? So apparently they get pretty suspicious and they threaten to hang him. They suspect that he may have killed his former comrades. General Adams, who's head of the Los Pinos Indian Agency, steps in just in time to save Packer, who then gives his first of several confessions, and I'm going to read that as follows, and I quote, "Old Man Swan," he says, "died first and was eaten by the other 5 persons about 10 days out of camp. 4 or 5 days afterwards, Humphreys died and was also eaten. He had about $133. I found the pocketbook and took the money," so he at least admitted he took the money. "Sometime afterwards, while I was carrying wood, the butcher was killed, and the other 2 told me accidentally, and he was also eaten." So next is Shannon Wilson Bell. He shot California with Swan's gun, but I killed Bell. Okay, he said, "I shot him. I covered up the remains, and I took a large piece along, presumably of meat, which he subsisted off of in order to be able to survive long enough to get back to civilization. Then traveled 14 days to the agency. Shannon Wilson Bell wanted to kill me with his rifle. He struck a tree and broke his gun." Now, General Adams at that time believed that if Packer were telling the truth, he would have no problem leading a party of men back to the original campsite and showing them. Initially, Alfred Packer said he would do this. But then he changed his mind. He later claimed to be lost and rushed at Constable Herman Lauder with a knife, after which they put him in jail. They're in Saguache. But he escaped from that jail because it was basically just a little log cabin. Well, they finally catch him in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so what they end up doing is they report Packer to the local sheriff. He's apprehended. They take him into custody. And then a second confession is given. Instead of claiming that each of the men gradually killed each other to survive, Packer's now saying that Shannon Bell had killed all the others while Packer was out scouting. He comes home and finds out what's going on. Bell tries to kill him, and he, in self-defense, kills Shannon Wilson Bell. That's the story. Now, according to, and this is kind of funny because there was a newspaper where the presiding judge, M.B. Jerry, was reported to say, and I'm going to read again the account given by the newspaper and then the historical account of the actual statement by the judge. The newspaper reported, "Stand up, you voracious man-eating son of a bitch, and receive your sentence. When you come to Hinsdale County, there were 7 Democrats, but you ate 5 of them, goddamn you. I sentence you to be hanged by the neck until you're dead as a warning against reducing the Democratic population of this country. Packer, you Republican cannibal, I would sentence you to hell, but the statutes forbid it."
Wow.
Even back then it was politicized. It was politicized even back then. The court records tell a different story and read as follows. Alfred Packer, the judgment of this court is that you be removed from hence to the jail of Hinsdale County and there be confined until the 19th day of May, AD 1883, and then that on that said day, 19th of May, 1883, you be taken from thence by the sheriff of Hinsdale County to a place of execution prepared for this purpose, at some point within the corporate limits of the town of Lake City, in the said county of Hinsdale, and between the hours of 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. of said day, you then and there, by said sheriff, be hung by the neck until you are dead. So he did say it 3 times, and may God have mercy upon your soul. Well, he ends up actually being sentenced to 40 years after that, rather than death by hanging, and then he's actually paroled in 1899. What's really interesting about all this, though, is that there were subsequent investigations, and the most significant of those began in the 1980s, which is just a few years before the investigations of archaeological evidence at the Donner Party site, right? So in July of 1989, this is 115 years after Packer allegedly consumes his companions, they exhume the bodies, all right? And this is carried out by James E. Starr, a professor of law specializing in forensic science at George Washington University. And what he actually finds is very lacking. And the conclusion given by Walter H. Birkby is that I don't think that there will ever be a way to scientifically demonstrate cannibalism. Cannibalism, per se, is the ingestion of human flesh, so you'd have to have a picture of the guy actually eating. Skip ahead to 1994. David P. Bailey, who's a curator of history at the Museum of Western Colorado, begins his own investigation. And in the Audrey Thrailkill collection of firearms, which was at that time owned by that museum, they said that there was a Colt revolver that had reportedly been found at the site of Packer's alleged crime. So they investigate the background of the pistol. They go deep, let me tell you. I mean, deep. They even turned up documents from the time of Packer's trial. And I quote from them, "A Civil War veteran that visited the crime scene stated that Shannon Bell had been shot twice, and the other victims were killed with a hatchet. Upon careful study of Bell, he noticed a severe bullet wound to the pelvic area and that Bell's wallet had a bullet hole through it. Interestingly, this seemed to corroborate Packer's claim that Bell had killed the other victims first and that Packer came back and shot Bell in self-defense." So we skip ahead to 2000, David P. Bailey back on the scene. He hadn't yet proven this link between the antique pistol and Alfred Packer. But he then discovers that forensic samples from 1989 exhumations, had been archived, and that analysis in 2001 with an electron microscope by Dr. Richard Duget at Mesa State College found microscopic lead fragments in the soil taken from underneath Shannon Bell's remains, and they matched, according to spectrographic analysis, with the bullets remaining in what was indeed Packer's pistol. So they say, while it appears certain that Bell was killed by a gunshot, the question of whether or not it was murder remains unanswered. But at least parts of the story actually jibe with what Alfred Packer said. And it seems that the others were indeed killed with a hatchet. Bell was shot twice with a pistol. and they found some evidence that links the pistol to Alfred Packer, which at very least is in keeping with his story. Whether it was self-defense, murder, what else, who knows? It
really is fascinating how much can still be gleaned from cases this old using modern technology and investigation processes. It can even be applied to cases going back to ancient history, but this whole entire story is fascinating, and Alfred Packer is but one of many characters, especially in the Western theater, if you will, that seem to be involved in these type of cannibalistic acts. And when they say it was the Wild West, it truly was in a lot of ways. There's so many different cultures, so many different people moving around at that time in history that I'm sure there's plenty of stories that were never recorded that were just as bizarre as this one, if not even more so.
Cannibalism in North America. This, of course, is just a brief survey of some of the more notable instances. We'll wrap things up when we return. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Guys, this has been, I don't want to say an appetizing episode, but it's been pretty entertaining, though. It's a good subject matter. I think we ought to cap this episode with a segment we haven't done in a while, Odd Bits of History.
Odd Bits of History.
I love that guy.
That's fantastic. All right. So our subject matter for Odd Bits of History tonight is a man who's famous for this name, Liver Eating Johnston.
I hear that the T is silent, by the way.
Well, see, I can't figure this out because in some spellings I see Johnson and in some I see Johnston. So
yeah, we'll go with Johnston, yeah.
You say Johnston or Johnson?
No, I said let's go with Johnston.
Okay, Johnston it is then. So this guy is, for those that don't know, he was a famous mountain man in the 1800s. And I read a book a few years ago called Crow Killer, The Saga of Liver Eating Johnston. Great book. This guy is one of these larger than life characters. Literally, actually. Guy was like 6'2", weighed like 250 pounds. They made a movie about him in the 70s. It was a Robert Redford movie. It's called Jeremiah Johnson. It kind of fictionalized his life. And reality probably somewhat followed the story. What had happened was, according to the myth anyway, he had married a flathead Native American woman. And while he was gone, the Crow Indians had killed her and apparently the unborn child that she was carrying. So he goes and he seeks out revenge on the Crow, and he keeps killing these bands of braves that come to, it's like a war. They're coming to kill him and he just kills them back. And to add insult to injury, he'll eat the liver from some of the braves to send this message along.
Kind of like a trophy almost in a way.
Yeah, like a trophy. But it's almost like a terror tactic. Like this guy's, he not only does he kill us and scalp us, he also eats our livers. So this apparently goes on for many years, and finally they call a truce. And this guy, one of the things that he was famous for was his special move. It was a drop kick. So he would just drop kick people and just completely take them out. So if you can imagine a guy that's 6'2", 250 pounds just laying a drop kick on you, it's probably gonna take the fight out of you. So
I'd say
he has this storied life. He goes on. For sure he was a law enforcement officer in some town out west. He was a sheriff in a town for a while, and eventually somehow he makes his way down to Los Angeles, California, in his later years, where he passes away at the VA hospital there, and they bury him in Hollywood, California, of all places. Now, I thought there was a movement maybe to exhume him and bury him someplace back, wherever he was from, or back in the out in the west someplace. But I don't know if that actually came to pass or not. So this guy's life is a great story, and this Crow Killer book, I found it, was a really entertaining read. Here's the bad part though, is it turns out that a lot of this stuff may be just myth. Did this stuff really happen, or is it just a great story? Did the guy make all the stories up himself, or did people make the stories up? I mean, it's probably a mixture of these things. But anyway, for those of you out there that have never heard of this, pick this book up. You can get it on Kindle for $7 or $8 probably. Probably get a paperback for the same amount of money and read it. So it's a lot of fun.
Well, I want to address the confusion about the T in the name, because as I had said earlier, I thought it was Johnson, and then Jason said it's Johnston. So there appears to be some confusion about this, though, because the film with Robert Redford was called Jeremiah Johnson, no T, right? However,
right.
So then you go to the Wikipedia page and liver-eating Johnson, no T, but then they also say he was born as John Jeremiah Garrison Johnston, and they actually say he did have a T. So at least historically, the actual man, John Jeremiah Garrison Johnston, was born Johnston with a T, okay, but is better known as John Liver-Eating Johnson, no T, and that was the name that made it into the film, where they combined the two and made it Jeremiah Johnson, once again, no T. So maybe that at least explains in part some of the confusion about the silent T in the name.
Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit confusing. Even that book that I was talking about, Crow Killer, no T, it's Johnson.
My grandparents, really quickly, well, actually, their grandparents probably, okay, they come over at Ellis Island. They were of German heritage. Their last name was Moskeller. And when they arrive at Ellis Island, they're told, okay, you're from here on out in America going to be known as Mosseller. And so Moskeller became Mosseller. And I think sometimes they take out consonants and things that make a name more difficult to pronounce. It gets lost sometimes over history. Micah Hanks, I was probably in ancient times, my ancestors were probably, I don't know. It was something weird and unpronounceable.
And earlier we talked about how some of these things become legend and almost fairy tale in their own way. I just want to add this to the narrative so that everyone's clear on this. Several sources say this, but of the many things Johnston did, his nickname proved to sort of be an exaggeration because he never consumed a human liver. He was tagged with the false name during a battle with the Sioux in 1868. So some claim that the battle was in 69 or 70, but Johnston himself stated it was in 1868. So Johnston and 15 other woodcutters were attacked by the Sioux as they were cutting wood to fuel steamboats out on Sioux land. At the end of the battle, Johnston stabbed a warrior in the side, and when he pulled his knife out, there was a bit of liver hanging on the blade. So as a joke, Johnston turned to his friends, held up his knife, and then asked if they wanted a chaw.
Oh my gosh.
That's kind of where the name of liver-eating Johnston actually originated.
Interesting. Yeah, it is very interesting. Yeah. Well, again, it just goes to show that what is made out to be a sword and in full impalement ends up being just a bit of liver on the blade on the pages of history. And again, there's a great philosophical paper that I have, which was published in a short book form called Skepticism in Historical Knowledge. And I've also got R.G. Collingwood's book, The Idea of History, which is a philosophical analysis of history. I would like to see somebody do the same thing with archaeology and analyze philosophical. Maybe I'll be the guy that does this. I actually am working on a paper right now, which is just nothing but like notes. I haven't actually written the paper, but I mean, the ideas that I'm accumulating are essentially just trying to look at the problems that we see in archaeology. The divide between genomics and what the archaeological record says. The way that culture, ideology, political correctness, and things like that sometimes color scientific interpretations of archaeology, and sometimes the stories that we see in history. I mean, I think this is a good episode to use as an example of that. We see the mythologization of actual history, and then we see some historical accounts, which some would call into question because, in truth, some of it may seem insensitive or just really out there or just grisly and gross and not the kind of thing, like you said, James, that's very appetizing. And so we almost want to kind of revise history and make it better. Conversely, sometimes we also try to update history and make it worse than it actually was because we remember the old adage, history was written by the victors. And so we want to try and remember those who were the historically disenfranchised, those who didn't make their way into the annals of history through, triumph and achievement, and unfortunately who either were written out of history or who were made to look terrible in the eyes of those victors who did write that history. And so trying to understand history through the lens of skepticism is so important. And with a subject that is so rife with potential for sensationalism like cannibalism, it's really hard to look at, again, the divide between the historical record of something like the Donner Party and the actual stories of cannibalism that occurred, which seems to be substantiated in the narrative, and yet the archaeological evidence for it seems to be paltry. Actually, if anything, it's actually poultry. It shows that they were eating anything but humans, but that doesn't necessarily contradict or refute the historical narrative. It's just that we have to learn to deal with these issues, and that's part of the broader study of history. And yes, we also have to be sensitive to issues. We have to be, mindful of things like political correctness, but at the same time, we can't let our mindfulness and our sensitivity color the way we interpret the facts, because at the end of the day, the facts are the facts, and we have to look at history very carefully, very critically, scientifically, and we have to go where the evidence leads. Gentlemen, the evidence has led me finally to this conclusion that there's one more glass before last call right here at the Crosstime Pub, and I intend to fill mine. How about you?
It's about time to head back out on the road.
Absolutely.
Indeed. I think also I'm going to have to probably skip the chicken wings tonight. For some reason, red sauce on wings and gnawing on a bone just doesn't seem as appetizing. I think I'll go with the proverbial beer nuts. But Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, thank you as always for joining me here nonetheless.
Pleasure to be here, and I'm just sticking with the Guinness tonight, fellas.
It's going to be a meatless night.
I think so. Yeah, we're all vegetarians after this conversation, at least for the rest of this evening at the Crosstime Pub. Head over to 7ages.org, follow our work, and send us an email if you'd like to, James, Jason, or Micah at 7ages.org, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. You can find us at all of the aforementioned and that website address that we gave you. And we hope to see you here next time when we reconvene and fill our glasses in this little corner of space-time that we occupy. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal.